What would happen if suddenly the Earth was ripped from its orbit and thrown into the void of the universe? No warning, no time to react. One morning, you look out the window, and the sky isn't like it used to be. The sun disappeared. It is not an eclipse, nor a weather phenomenon. It's as if our star had been erased from the cosmos. The day no longer dawns. Darkness settles. The clock ticks, but time seems to lose meaning. A strange silence takes over everything. You feel the air getting thicker, the temperature starts to drop, and nobody knows what's going on. At that moment, your instinct screams for answers, but there are no immediate explanations, just the suffocating uncertainty and the fear of what comes next. Earth, now outside the solar system, is adrift, alone in a hostile, cold, and unforgiving universe. What if this isn't just an unlikely science fiction scenario, but a real possibility discussed by scientists? Have you ever stopped to think about what keeps us alive here, in the delicate gravitational dance that sustains everything? What if this harmony is broken? What if there are forces in the universe capable of tearing us from the safety of our system as if we were a piece loose in the ocean? This is the kind of question that has no simple answers, but the theories surrounding this possibility are disturbing. And in this video, we will explore a scenario that goes far beyond imagination. A scenario that mixes science, chaos, and a type of darkness that not even our worst nightmares can reach. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think would happen if the Earth was really expelled from the solar system? Would we be able to survive? Or would we be doomed from the first second? Write your theory here in the comments. I will be reading each one of them. Are you ready to discover what could be lurking in the void between the stars? Earth, as far as we know, has always been part of a stable solar system, a finely tuned planetary gear around a star that provides us with energy, gravity, and time. But modern science has already identified hundreds of worlds that are not so lucky. They are called wandering planets or orphan planets, celestial bodies that wander through interstellar space without orbiting any star. They were detected using techniques such as gravitational microlensing, and their existence is not a hypothesis, it is a fact. What still remains in the realm of possibilities is the idea that Earth could become one of them. And as unlikely as it may seem, the forces involved in this type of event are real. Imagine for a moment that a gravitational anomaly, such as the close passage of a massive star, a dense cloud of dark matter, or even an indirect collision with another planet, could alter the Earth's orbital trajectory. This would be enough to break our link with the Sun and throw us out of the system's habitable region. In this scenario, we are no longer a planet in the solar system. We become a wandering object, moving in a straight line through space, without destination, without control, without light. Earth would become a dark speck across the galaxy, without any external source of energy. Science estimates that there are billions of wandering planets in the Milky Way. They are cold, invisible, and their origin is often linked to violent disturbances in planetary systems. And while our current technology still can't map them all, astrophysical models show they are more common than imagined just 2 decades ago. Earth, in this context, would not be a cosmic exception. It would be just another expelled world, an orbital debris condemned to cross the universe with no point of return. The most disturbing implication of this scenario is that it does not require the destruction of the planet, just a small change of course. The Earth would continue to exist physically, but disconnected from the link that makes life possible, the Sun. We would be alive, but out of the game. This transition from habitable planet to wandering planet could happen without any prior warning, and at that moment, the entire ecosystem as we know it would start operating on a countdown. But this dynamic hides a consequence that few people know about. Earth's ejection from the solar system would begin a relentless countdown. Exactly 8 minutes and 20 seconds after we lost the link with the sun, the last particle of light would reach us. After that, everything would go into complete darkness. We are not talking about an ordinary night, but the absolute absence of any natural lighting. The temperature would start to drop, yes, but the first real impact would be biological and immediate. Photosynthesis would cease completely. This doesn't just mean that the plants would stop growing. It means the entire base of the food chain would collapse in record time. Seaweed, phytoplankton, grasses, trees, everything would stop producing energy. And with them, the organisms that depend on this process to survive would also begin to die. Within days, entire herbivore populations would collapse. Soon after, the carnivores. Ecological bankruptcy would not occur slowly. It would spread like a domino effect, fast and uncontrollable. In this scenario, there would not even be time for natural adaptation. Living organisms were not designed to handle such an abrupt interruption of light energy. And even humans, with all their technology, would be faced with a brutal obstacle: the absence of any reference to day or night. Circadian cycles, fundamental to the functioning of the human brain, would go into disarray. The body would no longer know when to release hormones, when to rest, when to eat. Basic biological functions would be affected by a total lack of light, not just physical darkness, but the absence of rhythmic stimulation. The concept of time would become subjective. Society, still trying to understand what happened, would begin to live in artificial cycles. Artificial light stations would emerge as attempts to simulate daytime, but they would be insufficient to contain the physiological and psychological effects of total darkness. In regions dependent on solar energy, such as isolated communities or modern agricultural structures, production would cease instantly. There would be no more farming, heating, or lighting. Adaptation would depend exclusively on energy stocks and emergency measures, resources that, without the sun, would lose their primary source of regeneration. The darkness would not just be visual, it would also be thermal, functional, neurological, and more than that, psychological. All of humanity, suddenly deprived of its most fundamental point of reference, would find itself enveloped in unprecedented darkness, without knowing how much time would remain before the effects would become irreversible. When the light goes out for good, what remains is not just darkness, it is the collapse of the very idea of control. The illusion of stability that we build around our daily lives disappears with the last particle of solar energy. And at that moment, understanding how the universe really works stops being curiosity. It becomes survival. That's why content like this is essential. So, leave your like here on this video as a clear sign that you value themes that defy logic, science, and common sense. It's also the most direct way to make YouTube understand that you want to continue exploring the mysteries that many don't even dare to question. Now imagine, if we lose the light, what happens to the heat? Can the planet survive the absence of solar radiation? The answer involves a silent transformation that begins beneath our feet and completely redefines the Earth's surface. Without the constant presence of solar radiation, the Earth would quickly lose its ability to maintain its current temperature. The atmosphere, which today functions as a moderate thermal insulator, would no longer have an external source of energy to retain. In just a few weeks, the global average would drop dramatically, reaching approximately 73 degrees Celsius. The process would be quick and brutal. The polar regions would be the first to freeze completely, but before long, even the tropics would become uninhabitable. The notion of seasons would cease to exist. The entire planet would enter a single climate cycle, permanent freezing. The oceans would initially appear resistant, as water has a high thermal capacity. However, without heat input, their surfaces would begin to form ice crusts, especially in shallower areas. As the ambient temperature plummeted, these layers would expand, slowly thickening toward the depths. Marine life, especially in the upper regions, would be wiped out quickly. Only a few species in places with geothermal activity, such as hydrothermal vents, could resist, and even then for a limited time. The entire atmospheric dynamics would also change. Winds would cease, rains would disappear. The water cycle would be interrupted, and any form of precipitation would turn into fine, constant snow. Dry, freezing air would take over. Places that are now deserts would become ice plains, while coastal cities would be swallowed by solid layers that would advance from the coasts to the interior. The soil, frozen deep, would prevent any cultivation or regeneration of ecosystems. Energy systems based on fossil fuels would not compensate for thermal loss. Burning oil or natural gas would produce heat only in extremely confined spaces and for short periods. And in the long term, access to these fuels would be compromised by freezing infrastructure and pipelines. Solar energy would obviously be out of the question. The only possible source of heat on a large scale would be the use of the Earth's internal heat, something that only a few regions currently explore. This global freeze would also directly affect human biology. Exposure to the external environment for minutes without full protection would result in irreversible hypothermia. Movement would become impossible without advanced thermal clothing, which would not be available to everyone. Entire communities would find themselves trapped in makeshift buildings, trying to generate heat with whatever was left. Resources would become scarce in a matter of days. And if you think this scenario represents the limit of catastrophe, you haven't yet seen what happens to the very structure that makes life viable on Earth, the atmosphere. Because freezing is just the beginning. The real collapse begins when the air we breathe starts to disappear. With the planet plunged into extreme temperatures, the atmosphere, that invisible layer that allows life, begins to behave in completely unexpected ways. Solar heat, in addition to heating the surface, also keeps atmospheric gases in constant movement. Without this energy, the atmospheric balance begins to fail. The air that used to circulate freely, maintaining stable pressure and making breathing possible, begins to lose its dynamics. Slowly, the atmosphere becomes unstable, heavy, and uneven. In areas where the temperature reaches lower levels, denser gases, such as carbon dioxide and water vapor, begin to condense. This means that they no longer exist in the gaseous state, the only one in which they can be breathed, and start to form crystals or solid deposits on the planet's icy surface. Initially, this process would occur at the poles and regions of high altitudes, but with the progression of global freezing, even previously temperate areas would begin to record atmospheric condensations. Oxygen, which makes up about 21% of our atmosphere, is particularly sensitive to cooling. At 183 degrees C, it reaches its liquefaction point. In other words, in regions where this temperature is reached, and many would reach it, oxygen would literally leave the air, turning into liquid. This would compromise the breathability of the environment in a lethal way. Human life without access to this gas would be condemned to asphyxiation, even without initially realizing what is happening. Furthermore, with the loss of heat, air movement would practically cease. Without atmospheric currents, the gas mixture would stagnate. In certain regions, the concentration of a type of gas could exceed safety limits. Carbon dioxide, for example, accumulating in closed areas would make the environment toxic. The same would go for methane released from frozen soil. The atmosphere would no longer be a stable life support system and would become an invisible threat. Another unintuitive effect would be the gradual loss of the atmosphere itself to space. At extremely low temperatures and without the protective barrier of an active magnetosphere, which also depends on solar energy to remain dynamic, atmospheric particles would begin to escape Earth's gravity. This process is slow but steady, and over years or centuries could transform Earth into a nearly airless world like Mars. The planet wouldn't just freeze, he would suffocate. Every day, breathing would become more difficult, not for lack of space, but for lack of atmosphere. And given this, the only hope for survival would depend on an extreme solution, abandoning the surface completely. But there is an invisible link between this atmospheric collapse and an alternative few consider, an underground route that could hide the last chances to keep breathing. Human life as we know it is completely dependent on a complex infrastructure that operates in balance with the environment. Remove this balance, as would happen with the Earth expelled from the solar system, and the entire structure begins to crumble. The extreme cold, lack of light, and atmospheric collapse would trigger a cascading sequence of failures that would make daily life unviable in a matter of days. Electrical networks, which depend on components sensitive to temperature and current conduction, would be the first to fail. Frozen transmission lines would become fragile and brittle, and power plants would stop operating as they lost access to basic resources such as liquid water or transportable fuel. Power generation would collapse, and with it, everything that depends on electricity, heating, communications, food storage, transportation. Satellites, in turn, without connection to Earth bases and without constant orbital adjustments, would fall from their orbits or become pieces of space debris. Global communication would disappear. No radio, TV, or internet signal. Isolation would be total, not due to distance, but due to technological failure. Each region would become a bubble disconnected from the rest of the planet. In this new world, there would no longer be interconnected nations, only pockets of improvised survival. Modern cities with infrastructure based on continuous energy and automated systems would become death traps. Buildings would lose heat, pipes would freeze and burst, elevators would stop, perishable foods would become unusable, supermarkets and hospitals would stop working. Without access to basic resources, the population would face an immediate struggle for shelter and warmth. Social chaos would not be the result of conflicts. It would be a direct consequence of the lack of functionality of structures. And even more robust structures, such as refineries, reactors, and military centers, would be at risk. Without maintenance and under extreme conditions, catastrophic failures would become inevitable. Leaks, explosions, and release of toxic materials could occur without control. The planet, already hostile by nature, would become even more dangerous because of human technology itself, now out of control. In this inhospitable environment, human life would be forced to retreat. It would be necessary to abandon the streets, houses, and public spaces. Survival would no longer be a question of comfort and would become a question of thermal insulation, extreme rationing, and psychological resistance. Makeshift shelters would have to spring up in basements, tunnels, caves, anywhere that offered minimal protection from the cold and collapsing air. But even in the face of this catastrophic scenario, there is still hope, and it may be hidden beneath our feet in a kind of refuge that already exists, but that few consider to be the last frontier of survival. Thinking about a planet completely outside the solar system is not just an exercise in imagination, it is a direct challenge to what we take for granted. And now I want to know, in your opinion, what would be the biggest threat in this scenario? Extreme cold, loss of atmosphere, or complete social collapse? Or do you believe that human beings would find some way to resist for longer than we imagine? Write your theory here in the comments. I want to know how you see this extreme reality and what you think would happen to humanity in the face of an indifferent universe. Because as we try to understand how to survive on the surface, there is a possibility that defies logic, escaping the chaos by building a new civilization beneath the Earth. And some ideas that are already circulating among scientists indicate that this may not be as impossible as it seems, with the planet's surface frozen, uninhabitable, and without a functional atmosphere. The only plausible alternative for human survival would be below ground. This is where the concept of underground colonies comes in. An idea that, despite seeming straight out of science fiction, has already been seriously considered by scientists and defense engineers in several countries. The logic is simple. Even without the sun, the Earth's interior remains hot. Geothermal heat, generated by the constantly active core, can be used as a source of energy and thermal maintenance, creating pockets of life amid external climate collapse. Building an underground base isn't just about digging and inhabiting tunnels. It would require a complex structure with air filtration systems, food production, water recycling, and precision environmental control. The ideal depth would be between 500 and 2,000 meters, where the internal heat is sufficient to maintain habitable temperatures, even with the world outside completely frozen. Furthermore, layers of dense rock would protect against cosmic radiation, which would become more intense without an active magnetosphere. Some conceptual projects have already been presented, such as geothermal installations, adapted in abandoned mines, modernized nuclear shelters, and even underground cities inspired by lunar bases. The big challenge, however, is the scale. These structures would house only small groups, scientists, engineers, politicians, or elites with early access to necessary information and resources. The rest of the population would have little chance of finding shelter, much less conditions to survive in the long term. This raises an unsettling ethical question. Who decides who gets in? Underground survival, in this scenario, would not be a global solution, but a limited preservation tactic. The selection criteria would inevitably generate conflicts, political tensions, and disputes over access. And even within these refuges, the problems would not disappear. Extreme isolation, scarcity of resources, and emotional instability would create constant psychological pressure on survivors. Additionally, there is the question of long-term viability. Even with internal heat, the planet would still be in decline. Reserves would be finite. Maintaining the technology would require parts, energy, and constant knowledge. Any critical failure in a vital system, such as oxygen or water supply, could be fatal. Living underground would be like living inside a capsule, where every decision carries the weight of life or death. But if the surface is lost and the skies are hostile, perhaps the only way to preserve the human species is to make the underground home. A new kind of civilization, isolated, invisible, but still alive for now. And if this really happens, another question arises. What would happen if, over the years, the descendants of these survivors forgot the world above? Would humanity, living in the dark, stop believing that the sun once existed? Science looks for causes, but human thought has always looked for meanings, and when all natural explanations seem to fail, a disturbing hypothesis emerges. What if Earth hadn't been expelled from the solar system by chance? What if this trajectory towards the void was part of a deliberate experiment conducted by a superior intelligence? This idea does not just come from fantasy. Some physicists and cosmologists raise hypotheses that cross the boundaries between science and philosophy. The universe's simulation theory, for example, suggests that all observable reality may be the product of a programmed system, and that seemingly random events, such as the ejection of a planet, could be testing mechanisms, tests of resistance, adaptation, consciousness. If this is true, Earth's ejection could be a planned trigger to observe how we react in the face of total collapse. A way to measure our resilience as a species, or perhaps our ability to maintain social cohesion and technological advancement even under extreme conditions. The disappearance of the sun, in this context, would not be a failure in the system, but a variable inserted by someone or something, for purposes that we do not yet understand. This line of thinking also forces us to look at our place in the cosmos from a new perspective. Perhaps life on Earth is less unique than we imagine and more observed than we want to admit. Advanced civilizations, thousands or millions of years ahead of us, could be monitoring our behaviors, recording our choices, and studying our limits. The very idea that we are still alive, even after being launched into interstellar space, may be at the heart of this experiment. A planetary survival laboratory. This is not about irrational conspiracism, but about exploring a legitimate field of scientific and philosophical speculation. After all, if we still don't understand the totality of the laws that govern the universe, why exclude the possibility that we are part of something larger, intentional, programmed? What if reality is more like a controlled simulation than random chaos? Within this hypothesis, each extreme event could carry a hidden objective. The loss of light, the collapse of the biosphere, underground migration. All of this is perhaps being observed, measured, documented. And if that's the case, then we are being tested in real time, not just technologically, but morally, intellectually, and biologically. You've entered into one of the most intriguing debates about the universe, and now you have a theory in your hands that few have even imagined. This is not just information, it is intellectual provocation. Share this video with those you know are also looking for answers beyond the surface. Who else do you know who would be prepared to question the very fabric of reality? Send it now, and let's spread this reflection to those who truly value the great mysteries of the cosmos. Are we already being watched? What if the expulsion from Earth is just the beginning of something bigger? Something that involves not only our survival, but our true function within a universe that may never have been as random as we believe. Faced with climate collapse, the collapse of the atmosphere, and the threat of extinction on the surface, an audacious idea emerges. What if instead of seeking refuge underground or fleeing in smaller ships, the Earth itself became our means of transport? A planet ship crossing the galaxy towards a new home. As unlikely as it may seem, this hypothesis is already discussed within serious scientific circles, including theoretical simulations conducted by researchers linked to NASA and advanced astrophysics institutes. The concept is known as Earthship, not in the ecological sense, but literally. The idea would be to transform the planet itself into a kind of interstellar arc, using the gravity of nearby celestial bodies, interactions with black holes, or planetary-scale propulsion technologies to slowly alter its trajectory. Unlike a common ship, here the hull would be the Earth's crust, the crew, all of humanity. Energy would come from the geothermal core and artificial sources built to sustain the long journey. The goal? Bring Earth to the habitable zone of another star system. Of course, none of this is within our reach today, but this isn't just speculative fiction. Scientists are already modeling how external gravitational forces, such as from a binary star or a supermassive object passing by, could be harnessed to gradually alter the planet's orbit. Another hypothesis involves the use of gigantic planetary thrusters installed on the opposite side of the desired direction, burning crustal materials and releasing thrust on a large scale. This would require technology and global cooperation at unprecedented levels, but in an existential crisis, priorities change. This Earthship would not have a fixed point as its destination, but a dynamic goal, finding a star capable of supporting life again. The journey could take thousands, perhaps millions of years, which would involve entire generations living in transition. A planet powered not by engines, but by purpose. Humanity itself would come to see itself as a passenger on a living celestial body adapted to traverse space, with underground cities converted into permanent habitats and artificial environmental simulation systems to preserve the physical and mental health of the inhabitants. This transformation would require completely reprogramming society, the economy, and the relationship with natural resources. It would be necessary to treat every drop of water, every fragment of matter, as part of a closed and vital system. Life would stop being territorial and become existential. Keeping the planet functional would mean keeping itself alive. This new Noah's Ark wouldn't just save species, it would save the possibility of the future. But for some theorists, this idea goes beyond a technical solution. It can be a sign of civilizational maturity. Perhaps turning Earth into a ship is the logical next step for any advanced civilization faced with the depletion of its star. And if that's what awaits us, how do we know if other worlds have already done the same, crossing the universe as passengers on their own planets? Now I want to know. What mysterious hypothesis about the universe has crossed your mind? It could be that idea that seems too absurd to say out loud, or precisely because of that, it's the most interesting. Comment below. I want to read the boldest, most thought-provoking theories, the ones that no one has had the courage to explore yet. Some of them may, indeed, be turned into future videos. Let's build together this space where imagination meets science. The Earth has always seemed eternal to our eyes, solid, reliable, unshakable. But when we broaden our gaze and consider the scale of the universe, we realize how vulnerable our existence is. A planet suspended on a precise trajectory amidst colossal forces that we barely understand. Thinking about the possibility of being ejected from the solar system may seem like fantasy, but it serves as a brutal reminder. We are at the mercy of cosmic laws that do not ask for permission to act. Perhaps reflecting on this scenario is not just a dark curiosity, but a real invitation to value the fragile balance that sustains us. Because while there is light and atmosphere and stability, there is still time. Time to understand, to explore, to imagine what else the universe hides. And if this kind of thinking fascinates you as much as it unsettles you, being part of it is more than just watching videos. It's truly embarking on a journey through theories, discoveries, and questions that challenge everything we know about the cosmos. Here, each new hypothesis is a portal to something greater. So activate the bell and subscribe to the channel right now, because the next mystery could be exactly the one that will change the way you see reality. By the way, speaking of mysteries that defy all known logic, there's an upcoming video appearing on your screen right now. Click on it and continue this journey. What you see there could completely transform what you believe is possible.